This is HOA catastrophe. I watched the chain rattle, and she watched me panic. Karen shouted that my keys did not matter because the clamp was already locked. I stood in my own driveway, staring at the bright orange metal vise clamped around my front wheel, and she held up her clipboard like it was a court order. "You are in non-compliance, and I am submitting it," she said, voice flat and final. No room for negotiation. I am a restaurant kitchen manager. I run on tight timing and prep windows. My shifts start at 4 in the afternoon, and I do not get home until past midnight most nights. I have a custody and visitation routine with my daughter, and the HOA keeps targeting my schedule and my guests. My ex drops off our daughter every other Thursday evening, and my parents visit on weekends to help. Every single one of those arrivals has turned into a violation notice from the Heritage Oaks HOA board. Diane White, the communications director, treats guest parking like a personal insult. The clamp had gone on 10 minutes earlier while I was inside changing out of my work clothes. A landscaping contractor pretending not to listen was trimming hedges 2 houses down, and he had watched the whole thing. Diane stood on my driveway now, flipping through her booklet, and behind her a white tow truck with amber lights was idling at the curb. The driver leaned against the cab, arms crossed, waiting. This is Hilliard, Ohio. This is Heritage Oaks, a place where normal life becomes a parking violation. The HOA invented extra administrative fees that are not in the covenants, and Diane sends mass emails with new interpretations of old rules like she is handing down scripture. She has been doing it for 2 years, ever since she took over the communications role. Every email ends with a reminder that non-compliance will result in immediate enforcement action, and she means it. I looked at the clamp. I looked at Diane. I said my guest was here for 20 minutes to drop off furniture. She said, "I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says." Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. That is her trick. She never yells in public. She waits until she has the upper hand, then she speaks like she is reading a grocery list while your life falls apart. I asked her what rule. She said, "Guest parking requires a 72-hour advance permit application, and your guest did not display a valid decal." I said, "It was a moving truck. It was unloading. It was not even parked. It was stopped." She said, "Stopped is parked under the fire lane and street parking ordinance, and you failed to submit the form." She held up a bright orange windshield sticker that said violation without readable details and said, "This was placed on the vehicle before it departed. You are responsible for the tow fee, the clamp removal fee, and the administrative processing fee." The tow driver pushed off the cab and walked over. He looked at me, then at Diane, then back at me. He said, "You want me to hook it or leave the clamp?" Diane said, "Leave the clamp until he pays the release fee." Then she turned to me and said, "You can submit payment online or in person at the management office. The clamp stays until the account is clear. Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead." I swallowed my anger because I knew the moment to use it was coming. I had already started gathering proof. I had an email chain from the HOA management company admitting the notice date was wrong on 2 prior violations. I had screenshots of Diane sending late-night rule updates in the neighborhood group chat and then enforcing them the next morning like they had always existed. And I had something else, something I was holding back until the right moment. I did not say any of that. I just asked her how much. She said, $200 for the clamp removal, $150 for the administrative fee, and $50 for the violation citation. $400 total. I said, "For a 20-minute furniture drop?" She said, "For failing to comply with advance notice requirements." I said, "There is no advance notice requirement in the covenants," she said. "There is now. Effective as of the latest board resolution." I said, "When was that passed?" She said, "Last month." I said, "I never got a notice." She said, "It was posted in the newsletter and on the website. Failure to review updates is not an excuse." The tow driver handed me a slip with no readable text and said, "You got until 6 tonight or it goes to the yard." Diane said, "And if it goes to the yard, there is a daily storage fee." I asked her if she got a cut. She did not answer. She just walked back to her car, got in, and drove away. The tow truck followed her. I stood there for a minute. Then I went inside and called my buddy Marcus. Marcus is a city code enforcement officer. He does not work for the HOA. He works for the city, and he knows what is actually enforceable and what is just HOA theater. I told him what happened. He said, "They cannot tow you for a moving truck stop. That is not a fire lane, and if the truck was actively unloading, it is not even parked under city code." He said, "They are inventing rules, and if they are charging fees that are not in your covenants, that is a breach." He said he would come by tomorrow and take a look. I paid the $400 online that night because I could not afford to let it go to the yard. My daughter was coming over the next evening, and I needed the car. But I saved the receipt, and I saved the email confirmation, and I added it to the folder I was building. Diane did not know it yet, but every move she made was going into a file that was going to come back at her with force. The next morning, Marcus showed up. He walked the driveway, checked the curb paint, looked at the street, and took photos. He said, "There is no fire lane designation here. There is no posted no parking sign within 50 feet. The HOA cannot enforce city parking code. They can only enforce deed restrictions, and even then only if they follow their own process." He said, "If they are charging administrative fees that are not in the covenants, you can challenge it." He said, "And if they are coordinating with a tow vendor to generate fees, that is a potential kickback issue." He handed me a printed copy of the city parking ordinance and said, "Keep this. You are going to need it." That same afternoon, I got an email from the HOA management company. It said there was a hearing scheduled for the following Tuesday at 6 in the evening to review my compliance status. It said failure to attend would result in automatic escalation of enforcement measures. It said Diane White would be presenting the case. I replied and asked what case. They did not answer. I emailed Marcus. He said, "Go to the hearing. Bring everything. Bring the city ordinance, bring your covenants, bring the receipt, bring the email chain, and bring me if you want. I will come as a witness." I said yes. Tuesday came. I showed up at the HOA clubhouse exterior walkway as people arrived. It was outside, not inside a meeting room. The board had set up a folding table on the concrete pad near the entrance. Diane was already there, standing next to the table with a stack of binders and a laptop. She was wearing a black cardigan with the hood up and a red baseball cap. She saw me and smiled. She said, "Glad you could make it. This should be quick." 3 board members sat at the table. Diane stood to the side. The board president, a man in his 60s, opened the meeting by saying they were reviewing multiple compliance violations related to guest parking and unauthorized vehicle presence. He said my name and asked if I was ready to respond. I said yes. He said, "Miss White will present the findings first." Diane opened her binder. She pulled out printed photos of my driveway on 4 different dates. She pointed to each one and narrated, "Guest vehicle without decal. Guest vehicle parked overnight without advance permit. Moving truck stopped in violation of fire lane proximity. Contractor vehicle blocking sidewalk access." She said, "Each of these represents a clear and documented violation of Heritage Oaks community standards." She said, "The homeowner has been notified multiple times and has failed to take corrective action." She said, "The board has the authority to impose escalating fines and enforcement measures, including vehicle immobilization and towing, to ensure compliance." The board members nodded along. One of them asked if I had submitted any permit applications. I said no, because the guests were never staying long enough to require one, and the covenants do not require advance permits for short visits. Diane cut in and said, "The covenants were amended." I said, "When?" She said, "The amendment was approved at the annual meeting and posted on the website." I said, "I was not at the annual meeting because I was working, and I never received a mailed notice of the amendment." She said, "Attendance is not required for amendments to be valid." I opened my folder. I pulled out the printed city ordinance and handed it to the board president. I said, "This is the city parking code." It states that a vehicle actively loading or unloading is not considered parked. And it states that HOA enforcement of city parking regulations is not permitted unless the HOA has been granted specific authority by the city. I pointed to the section. I said, "The city has not granted Heritage Oaks that authority." The board president read it. He looked at Diane. She said, "We are not enforcing city code. We are enforcing community standards." I said, "Your standards cannot override city law." One of the other board members said, "What about the overnight guest vehicle?" I pulled out the email chain from the management company. I said, "This email admits that the violation notice for that date was issued 3 days before the alleged violation occurred." "That is impossible." The board member read it. He looked at Diane. She said that was a clerical error. I said, "It is evidence that the process is broken." I said, "And if the process is broken, none of these fines are valid." Diane was not smiling anymore. She said, "The clerical error does not invalidate the underlying violation." I said, "It invalidates your credibility." She said, "I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says." I said, "Then let us see the rule. Show me the amendment. Show me the board resolution. Show me the vote." She said nothing. The board president said, "We will need to review the records and reconvene." I said no. "We are finishing this now." I pulled out my phone. I opened the screenshots I had saved from the HOA neighborhood group chat. I held the screen up so the board could see. I said, "This is a conversation between Diane and 2 other board members coordinating enforcement actions against specific homeowners. This message says, we need to hit him with everything at once so he does not have time to fight it. This message says, use the tow vendor, they move faster than the management company. This message says, make sure the fees stack so he has to pay to get out from under it." The board president stared at the screen. Diane said, "That is taken out of context." I said, "It is a screenshot. The context is the whole conversation." I said, "You have been using the HOA enforcement process as a weapon, and you have been coordinating with a tow vendor to generate fees. That is not community standards. That is retaliation." The board president said, "We need to see the full conversation." I said, "I will email it to every homeowner in Heritage Oaks right now if you want. Or you can shut this down and fix your process." Diane tried to interrupt. She said, "This hearing is not about internal communications." The board president held up his hand and said, "Miss White, please step back." He looked at me and said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want my $400 refunded. I want the violation citations removed from my account. I want a written policy on guest parking that actually matches the covenants. And I want an audit of every fee the HOA has collected in the past year." The board went quiet. One of the members said, "We cannot authorize an audit without a full board vote." I said, "Then vote." Another member said, "We need to consult the attorney." I said, "Fine. Consult the attorney. But until you do, you freeze all enforcement actions, and you stop targeting homeowners." Diane said, "You cannot dictate terms to the board." I turned to her and said, "Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead." I held up the printed city ordinance again. I said, "This is from the city. Marcus is standing right over there, and he is ready to testify that your fire lane claim is false. You want to keep pushing this, or do you want to walk it back now before it gets worse?" The board president looked at Diane. He said, "I think we need to table this and regroup." Diane said, "We are not tabling anything. The homeowner is in violation and the enforcement action stands." The board president said, "Diane, we need to review the documentation." She said, "I am the communications director. I control the documentation." He said, "That is the problem." One of the other residents who had been waiting for their turn stepped forward and said, "I want to see those screenshots too." Another resident said, "I got hit with a $300 fine last month for the same guest parking thing, and I want to know if that was coordinated." Diane said, "This is not a public forum." The board president said, "Actually it is." That is what a hearing is. Diane grabbed her binder and said, I am not going to sit here and be accused of misconduct by someone who refuses to follow the rules. She walked toward her car. The board president said, Diane, we are not finished. She kept walking. She got in her car and drove off. The board president looked at me. He said, we will schedule a follow-up meeting and notify you. I said, and my refund? He said, we will review it. I said, no. I am not leaving until I get confirmation. He looked at the other two board members. They had a quiet conversation. Finally, he said, we will issue a refund pending the attorney review. I said, in writing. He said yes. I left the walkway and found Marcus in the parking area. He said, that went better than I expected. I said, it is not over. He said, it never is with these people. 2 days later, I got an email from the management company. It said the board had voted to freeze all enforcement actions pending a policy review, and it said my refund had been processed. It also said Diane White had been asked to step back from enforcement duties while the review was ongoing. It did not say she had been removed, just that she was stepping back. I forwarded the email to Marcus. He replied, that is progress. Watch your back though. People like her do not let go easy. He was right. 3 days after that, I came home from work at midnight and found a bright orange windshield sticker on my car that said violation without readable details. There was no explanation, no citation number, no date, just the word violation and a phone number. I called the number. It went to voicemail. The voicemail said, you have reached Heritage Oaks Enforcement Services. Leave a message with your address and we will return your call within 2 business days. I took a photo of the sticker and emailed it to the management company. I said, I thought enforcement was frozen. They replied the next morning and said, we are investigating. That sticker does not match our current format. We believe it may have been placed by an unauthorized party. I knew who the unauthorized party was. I called Marcus again. He came by that afternoon, looked at the sticker and said, that is harassment. If she keeps doing this, you can file a police report. I said, I want to, but I need more proof. He said, set up a camera. I said, I already have one. He said, good. Then let her hang herself. That night I checked the footage. The camera had caught Diane pulling into my driveway at 11:30, getting out of her car, walking up to my sedan, and slapping the sticker on the windshield. She had been wearing the same black cardigan and red baseball cap. She stood there for a moment, looked at the house, then got back in her car and left. The whole thing took less than a minute. If you are enjoying this wild ride, smash that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. I saved the footage and sent it to the management company with a subject line that said, Diane White trespassing and placing unauthorized enforcement stickers. I copied the board president. I copied Marcus. I said this is harassment and I am filing a police report if it happens again. The management company replied within an hour. They said, we have forwarded this to our attorney and to the board. Diane White has been suspended from all HOA duties effective immediately. We apologize for the inconvenience and the unauthorized action. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not. 2 weeks later, the HOA claims a new enforcement wave starts at midnight, and Diane is using the clock like a weapon. I got an email at 10 in the evening saying that all homeowners must submit updated vehicle registration and guest parking records by midnight or face automatic fines starting at $50 per day. The email came from Diane's personal address, not the HOA management account. It was not an official notice, but it was formatted to look like one. It had the Heritage Oaks logo at the top and a footer that said, failure to comply will result in immediate enforcement action. I forwarded it to the management company and said, is this real? They replied at 10:30 and said, no. That email was not authorized. Diane White is no longer acting in any official capacity. Please disregard. I replied and said, she is still sending emails with the HOA logo. That is impersonation. They said, We are addressing it. I did not hear anything else that night. The next morning, I got a knock on my door. It was Marcus. He said, I heard there was an incident last night. I said, Diane sent a fake enforcement email trying to scare people into submitting records. He said, that is fraud. I said, the management company said they are addressing it. He said, addressing it is not enough. You need to file a formal complaint with the board and get it on record. I said, I already sent the screenshots. He said, send them again. Send them to every board member individually. Make them respond. I said, what if they ignore it? He said, then you go to the state. Ohio has an HOA ombudsman program. You file a complaint there, and they investigate. I did what he said. I sent the email to all 5 board members with the subject line, Diane White Fraudulent Enforcement Notice. I included the screenshot, the management company's response, and a request for immediate action. I got replies from 3 of them within 2 hours. All 3 said they were unaware of the email, they did not authorize it, and they were working with the attorney to address Diane's conduct. The board president called me that afternoon. He said, we are terminating Diane White's affiliation with the HOA effective immediately. She will no longer have access to HOA email accounts, HOA files, or HOA enforcement authority. We are also reviewing all enforcement actions from the past year to identify any irregularities. I said, what about refunds? He said, if we find that fees were improperly assessed, we will issue refunds. I said, what about the tow vendor? He said, we are auditing that relationship as well. I said, I want it in writing. He said, you will have it by the end of the week. I got the letter 4 days later. It was signed by the board president and countersigned by the HOA attorney. It said Diane White had been removed from all HOA rules. All enforcement actions initiated by her in the past 6 months were under review, and any improper fees would be refunded within 30 days. It also said the board was implementing a new guest parking policy that aligned with the original covenants and did not require advance permits for short visits. I forwarded the letter to Marcus. He replied, that is a win. But keep the camera running. I thought the fight was over. It was not. Diane did not go quietly. She started a Facebook group called Heritage Oaks Homeowners Truth and began posting screenshots of board communications, claiming the board was retaliating against her for exposing financial mismanagement. She posted my name and address, along with a claim that I had threatened her during the hearing. She posted the photos of my driveway and said I was running an illegal rental operation using guest parking as cover. None of it was true, but it was public, and it was spreading. Other homeowners started commenting, some supporting her, some calling her out. The group grew to over 100 members in 2 days. The board sent a cease and desist letter through their attorney, demanding she remove the posts and shut down the group. She ignored it. I called Marcus. He said, that is defamation. You can sue her. I said, I do not have the money for a lawsuit. He said, you do not need money. You need a restraining order. File for a civil protection order based on the harassment and the false claims. If the court grants it, she has to take the posts down and stop contacting you. I went to the county courthouse the next day and filed the petition. I attached the camera footage, the fake enforcement email, the screenshots from the Facebook group, and the board's termination letter. The clerk said I would get a hearing date within 2 weeks. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. I showed up with Marcus and a printed binder of evidence. Diane showed up with a different binder and no attorney. The judge asked her if she wanted to represent herself. She said yes. The judge said, all right, let us hear it. I went first. I walked the judge through the timeline, the tire clamp incident, the fake fees, the unauthorized enforcement email, the trespassing, the defamatory Facebook posts. I showed the footage. I showed the emails. I showed the board's termination letter. The judge listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at Diane and said, your turn. Diane opened her binder and pulled out printed screenshots of the HOA group chat. She said, this homeowner has been violating community standards for months. He has refused to comply with guest parking policies. He has made false accusations against me. and he has used his friendship with a city employee to intimidate the board. She pointed at Marcus and said, "That man has no authority over HOA policy, yet he has been advising this homeowner to defy the board and disrupt enforcement actions." The judge said, "Is that man here in an official capacity?" Marcus stood and said, "Yes, Your Honor. I am a city code enforcement officer, and I provided the homeowner with information about city parking ordinances after he was incorrectly cited for a violation that does not exist under city law." The judge said, "So you were doing your job?" Marcus said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked at Diane and said, "What about the Facebook posts?" She said, "I have a First Amendment right to share information about HOA activities." The judge said, "You do not have a right to post someone's address and accuse them of criminal activity without evidence. Do you have evidence that he is running an illegal rental?" She said, "The evidence is the pattern of guest parking violations." The judge said, "That is not evidence of a rental operation. That is evidence of guests." The judge flipped through my binder. He stopped on the termination letter and read it. He said, "The HOA board has removed you from all roles and stated that your enforcement actions are under review. Is that correct?" Diane said, "The board is retaliating against me for exposing their financial mismanagement." The judge said, "Do you have evidence of financial mismanagement?" She said, "I have concerns." The judge said, "Concerns are not evidence." The judge closed the binder and said, "I am granting a temporary protection order. Miss White, you are prohibited from contacting the petitioner, posting about the petitioner on social media, entering the petitioner's property, or initiating any enforcement actions against the petitioner. You will remove all posts referencing the petitioner from your Facebook group within 48 hours. We will reconvene in 90 days for a final hearing. If you violate this order, you will be held in contempt." Diane said, "This is a violation of my rights." The judge said, "No, this is a consequence of your actions. We are done here." I walked out of the courthouse, and Marcus said, "That went as well as it could." I said, "She is not going to stop." He said, "She does not have a choice now. If she violates the order, she goes to jail." The posts came down that night. The Facebook group went private the next day. I did not hear from Diane again. The HOA refunded my $400 2 weeks later, along with an apology letter signed by the board president. The letter said the board had completed its policy review and was implementing new guest parking guidelines that did not require advance permits or fees for short visits. It said the board had also terminated its contract with the tow vendor and was seeking a new vendor with transparent pricing and clear procedures. I got a separate letter from the management company a week after that. It said the board had voted to reimburse all homeowners who had been charged improper guest parking fees in the past year, and that the reimbursements would be processed within 60 days. It said the total amount being refunded was over $12,000 across 43 homeowners. I forwarded the letter to Marcus. He replied, "That is what happens when you hold them accountable." But the story was not over yet. The climax came a month later, at the next HOA board meeting. The board had scheduled a special session to approve the new guest parking policy and to vote on whether to pursue legal action against Diane for the fake enforcement email and the defamatory posts. The meeting was open to all homeowners, and the clubhouse meeting room was packed. I showed up early and sat in the front row. The board president opened the meeting by summarizing the events of the past 2 months, the enforcement complaints, the audit findings, the policy review, and Diane's removal. He said the board had consulted with their attorney and determined that the HOA had grounds to file a civil suit against Diane for fraud and defamation. He said the board was seeking homeowner input before proceeding. One of the homeowners stood and said, "I think we should sue. She cost us $12,000 and she lied about people." Another homeowner said, "I do not think we should waste more money on legal fees. Let it go." A third homeowner said, "If we do not hold her accountable, she will do this to someone else." The board president said, "We will take a vote. But before we do, I want to give the floor to anyone who has additional information to share." I raised my hand. He said, "Go ahead." I stood and pulled out a plastic evidence bag holding a broken zip tie with no readable text. I said, "This is from the tire clamp that was placed on my vehicle. I had it examined by a mechanic. The clamp was not a standard HOA-issued device. It was a consumer model purchased online, and it was installed without proper authorization. I also have a receipt from the tow vendor showing that the HOA account was credited $50 for every clamp placement, which means the HOA was incentivized to clamp vehicles whether or not the violations were valid." The room went silent. The board president said, "Where did you get that information?" I said, "The tow vendor provided it as part of a city audit. Marcus filed a complaint with the city after the hearing, and the city launched an investigation into the vendor's practices. The vendor cooperated and provided financial records showing payments to the HOA and to Diane personally." The board president looked at the other board members. He said, "Did we know about this?" One of them said no. Another said, "This is the first I am hearing about it." The board president said, "We need to see those records." I said, "The city will provide them to you. They are also providing them to the state attorney general, because kickback schemes involving HOA vendors are a felony in Ohio." A homeowner in the back row said, "So Diane was getting paid to clamp people's cars?" I said, "Yes. And the HOA was getting paid too." The board president said, "That contract has been terminated." I said, "I know. But the fees we paid are still gone, and some of those fees went into Diane's pocket." The room erupted. People were shouting questions. The board president banged his gavel and said, "Order. We will address this." I said, "There is one more thing." I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshot of the HOA group chat. I said, "This is the conversation I showed at the enforcement hearing." But there is more. I scrolled down and held up the phone. I said, "This message, sent by Diane, says, we can use the enforcement actions to pressure specific homeowners into selling if we need to free up inventory for new buyers. That is not enforcement. That is extortion." The board president stared at the screen. He said, "I need a copy of that." I said, "I already emailed it to the management company and to your attorney. I also sent it to the state HOA ombudsman." He said, "When?" I said, 3 weeks ago. He said, "Why did you not bring this up sooner?" I said, "Because I wanted to see if you would do the right thing first." "You did. Now I am finishing the job." The board went into a closed executive session. The homeowners waited in the meeting room. After 40 minutes, the board came back. The board president said, "The board has voted unanimously to pursue legal action against Diane White for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud the HOA. We are also cooperating fully with the city and state investigations. Any homeowner who is charged improper fees will receive a full refund, and we are implementing a new vendor oversight policy to prevent this from happening again." He paused and said, "I also want to address the elephant in the room. The board failed to oversee Diane's activities, and we failed to catch the kickback scheme before it became a crisis. That is on us. We are reviewing our governance structure, and we are committed to transparency moving forward." A homeowner stood and said, "What about the policy?" The board president said, "The new guest parking policy has been approved. No advance permits, no fees for short visits, and no enforcement actions without written notice and a reasonable opportunity to respond. It is effective immediately." The meeting ended. I walked out and found Marcus in the parking area. He said, "You just nuked her entire operation." I said, "She earned it." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now we wait for the state to finish the investigation, and we watch her get charged." 3 months later, a city inspector confirmed what the HOA could not enforce. The city audit concluded that the tow vendor had violated multiple city ordinances by placing tire clamps on private property without proper authorization, and by charging fees that exceeded the maximum allowed under Ohio law. The vendor's business license was suspended, and the company was ordered to refund all fees collected from Heritage Oaks homeowners over the past 18 months. The total refund amount was over $30,000. Diane was charged with 2 counts of theft by deception and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 3 years. She pled no contest and was sentenced to 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution to the HOA and to affected homeowners. She was also banned from serving in any HOA leadership role in Ohio for 10 years. The HOA froze enforcement pending a policy rewrite. The board hired a new management company and brought in an outside consultant to overhaul the enforcement process. The new policy required written notice, a hearing before any fines could be assessed, and an independent review of all enforcement actions by a third party. The board also implemented quarterly financial audits and published all vendor contracts on the HOA website. Karen was forced to retract her claim in writing. As part of the settlement, Diane had to send a formal apology letter to every homeowner in Heritage Oaks, admitting that she had misused her authority, violated HOA policies, and made false claims about specific homeowners. The letter was posted on the HOA website and mailed to every household. It ended with a statement that she accepted full responsibility for her actions and would not contest any legal or financial consequences. The funny karma moment came during the final board meeting where the settlement was announced. Diane was required to attend and read the apology letter aloud. She stood at the podium, visibly shaking, and started reading. Halfway through, she tried to interrupt and add her own commentary about how the board had failed to support her. The board president cut her off and said, "You are reading the letter, not editorializing. If you cannot do that, we will proceed with the lawsuit." She finished reading. When she sat down, the board called for a vote on whether to accept the settlement. Diane tried to interrupt again, and the meeting voted anyway. The motion passed unanimously. Diane walked out without saying another word. I got my full refund check 2 weeks later. $400 for the clamp removal, plus an additional $300 in reimbursed administrative fees that I did not even know I had been charged. The check came with a letter from the new management company apologizing for the previous administration's conduct and thanking me for bringing the issues to light. I framed the letter and hung it in my garage, right next to the printed photo of the tire clamp on my wheel. Every time I look at it, I remember that moment on my driveway when Diane said my keys did not matter because the clamp was already locked. She was wrong. The keys always mattered. I just had to find the right lock. My daughter comes over every other week now, and my parents visit whenever they want. No permits, no fees, no orange stickers. The HOA still exists, but it is not a weapon anymore. It is just a boring administrative body that fixes streetlights and organizes the annual yard sale. Diane is gone. The tow vendor is gone, and the kickback scheme is dead. Marcus still stops by sometimes to check in. He says I should run for the board. I tell him I would rather set myself on fire. He laughs and says, "Fair enough. But if they ever try this again, you know what to do." I say, "Yeah." I keep the camera running. I hope your driveway stays tow-free.